Class has begun. Thank you so much for coming to this year's Jim Klee Forum. I am going to hand it over to Kathy to introduce the annual forum, and then I will be happy to introduce this year's speaker.
Hello. It's good to see so many faces. My name is Kathy Scottmeyer, and I am currently serving as the director of the School of Social Sciences in the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. I'm also a professor of psychology, so one of my first events was Jim Klee when I came here 15 years ago. So Jim Klee is kind of special to me. I also hosted a couple of Jim Klee events. This is just an amazing day. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Grateful to see students, faculty, members of our community, and those of you who are coming in virtually. Before we begin, I want to share with you something that I have become a bit of a tradition in my classrooms. I want to acknowledge the land that on which we gather. The University of West Georgia sits on the traditional lands of the Muskogee or Creek people. And I want to recognize and honor their enduring relationship to this land, their history, and their continued presence. As we engage in learning and dialogue tonight, we do so with an awareness of that history and with a commitment to respect and relational responsibility. So this forum carries the name of Jim Klee. He's a longtime member of the psychology program, and he helped to shape its intellectual character during the formative period. During his tenure, the program was evolving. It was moving beyond this kind of narrow technical model of psychology and leaning into more deeply into questioning questions of meaning, ethics, history, and what it truly means to be human. Jim believed that psychology should cultivate thinkers, not just practitioners. He expected students to wrestle with ideas. He valued serious reading, serious conversation, and disagreement done well. I suspect that if he were sitting in the audience tonight, he would be listening very closely and preparing at least one question that would push us just a little further than we planned to go. As the program expanded its graduate education and strengthened its identity as a place where psychology is understood as a human science, Jim's influence helped anchor that direction. The Jim Klee Forum exists in that spirit. It exists to keep inquiry alive, to create space for rigorous, thoughtful, and courageous dialogue. I also want to take a moment to thank John Buchanan for his continued generosity and faithful support of the Jim Klee Fund. Support like this is what makes evenings like this possible, and we are deeply, deeply grateful for it. So if you feel so inspired to sustain events like this and other opportunities within the psychology program, you are warmly invited to do so. You can simply scan the QR code behind me to learn more about how to contribute. And now it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Nisha Gupta to the podium. Dr. Gupta is a member of our psychology faculty whose work reflects the depth and seriousness that Jim Klee Forum was created to honor. Her scholarship engages critical and humanistic psychology, contemplative traditions, and questions of social justice and liberation. She asks how inner life and collective life intersect and how psychology can move beyond individualism towards relational and ethical transformation. In her teaching and writing, she consistently invites students to think carefully about power, subjectivity, and what it means to practice psychology responsibly in the world. She embodies the kind of reflective, rigorous inquiry that this forum is meant to sustain. I'm grateful for her leadership in helping bring tonight's event together, and I'm delighted that she's going to be introducing our speaker, Dr. Nisha Gupta.
I didn't expect that. That was very sweet. Hi, everybody. It's a privilege to introduce this year's Jim Klee speaker, Dr. Mark Freeman. Mark is a pioneering voice in psychology who has worked for decades to emphasize the importance of narrative in how psychology understands and appreciates human life. He serves as Distinguished Professor Emeritus. Here we go. He serves as Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Ethics, Society, and Psychology at the College of the Holy Cross. and he is a prolific and poetic writer of many works of beauty, including Rewriting the Self, History, Memory, and Narrative, Finding the Muse, a socio-psychological inquiry into the conditions of artistic creativity, and Do I Look at You with Love, Reimagining the Story of Dementia. Mark has essentially devoted his career to advocating for the very kind of work we too hold dear in West Georgia's psychology program. Our program is known around the world for an approach to psychology that honors human subjectivity, what we've traditionally called human science psychology. This means we practice a kind of scientific research that doesn't just reduce human beings to numbers and statistics, but honors people's rich, descriptive stories about what it means to be human. And Mark has been at the forefront of having human science psychology taken seriously across the globe. He was a key player in developing the APA, Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, and served as its first president. And SQIP is a conference that many of our faculty and students participate in now yearly. And more recently, he's been helping to build an interdisciplinary movement called the Psychological Humanities. This is an approach to psychology that expands beyond science to explore what literature, poetry, and art might teach us about the beautiful, messy fullness of psychological life, to quote Mark. It is a profound reimagining of psychology that embraces methods from the arts and humanities to better understand the human condition. He's published his vision for it in the recent book, Towards the Psychological Humanities, a modest manifesto for the future of psychology. And that's exactly what we've invited him to talk to us about tonight, his journey and vision for the psychological humanities, and perhaps what this interdisciplinary vision could mean for us at West Georgia. I'm looking at you, Clint. But before I hand it off to you, Mark, I just want to say that a word kept popping up in my mind as I prepared this introduction. And the word is to cherish. To cherish something is to hold it dear, to care deeply, tenderly, and lovingly about its existence. And to me, Mark, that seems to be what you've been arguing for a vision of a psychology that truly cherishes human life and sees poetry, literature, and art as language that can demonstrate that cherishing. Each and every human life deserves cherishing. And so please know that what I see you've been fighting for all along is a psychology of love. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I like the word cherish, so I got to think about that a little bit more. So the title of my talk is To Be Anxious in the Right Way: Psychological Sciences, the Psychological Humanities, and Beyond. As some of you know, or may know, the phrase in the title is from a famous quote by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, from his book, The Concept of Anxiety. It's great to be here. Finally, I've known about this program for many, many years, and I've known many of the people in this program, and I still do. In fact, I can safely say that there may be no department in the world that's as familiar to me as the one here at West Georgia. So being here to give this talk feels really special. I appreciate it greatly. And it's also been wonderful over the past hour or so to meet new, interesting people, not just from this particular program, but from other walks of life around the university. So thank you for being. I'm going to dive right in and begin with a premise. And that is that psychology has always struck me as an anxious discipline, and not in the right way. I felt this acutely back in the early 70s when I took my first psychology course. There I was wanting to dig into the depths of being, only to find out that it was pretty much irrelevant. Where were the people? I wondered. And love and death and all the rest. Now, I was naive, no question about that. And maybe because of some of my own early encounters with love and death and all the rest, I was more primed to explore all that deep stuff than some of my classmates. Be that as it may, the psychology that I encountered back then was a far and shrunken cry from what I was seeking. It was as if it had cordoned off a space that only included that which could be known, that which could be contained, turned into variables, while right outside was teeming life. I love how Marilyn Robinson puts the matter in her collection of essays called When I Was a Child, I Read Books. Quote, "We live on a little island of the articulable, which we tend to mistake for reality itself." Indeed, helps keep the anxiety at bay. Speaking of books, so many books back then. Pynchon and Barth, freaky stuff like that, but also Faulkner and Marquez and lots of others. I loved it all, but I really wasn't quite sure where to go with it. Eventually, I began encountering different kinds of books. And I don't know if I ever mentioned this to Nietzsche, but one of those books was The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann, Jungian scholar. And that was in a course called Models of Consciousness, taught by a tall, lanky Texan with a flat top, buzz cut, a weathered face and a serious drawl. And there was also The Field of Consciousness by Aaron Gurevich in a course in phenomenological psychology, taught by a Merleau-Ponty scholar who paced in front of the class, sleeves rolled up, smoking butts, trying to lead us into the depths. There was also Visual Thinking by Rudolf Arnheim in a course by that title, which remarkably enough was offered in the psych department. I did a lengthy paper back then on Gestalt psychology and abstract art. And between those courses and books and a lot of poetry, I felt like I was finally on a path to where I wanted to be, somewhere real. I wanted peace of all that. And as much as I loved literature and philosophy, I still wanted it to be in psychology, which at its best, I believe can still be pretty cool and valuable. Like it is here. And at a few other places where students are given the opportunity to get off that island of the articulable and encounter human reality in its messy, sometimes beautiful, sometimes awful fullness. Anxious though it may leave you, but in the right way. What I wanted, though, of course, I couldn't name it then, was the psychological humanities. So where might I do it? As luck would have it, I landed at the University of Chicago in the Committee on Human Development, which was something of a do-it-yourself program where I would be free to roam well beyond the confines of psychology, which I did. I know this lecture isn't Freeman's life story, but I did want to give you a sense of the intellectual climate I encountered there, mainly because it amplified in a huge way this burgeoning desire to help fashion a different kind of psychology than the one I'd encountered as an undergraduate. Here are some selected course titles from my manuscript. Some somewhat standard ones: psychoanalytic inquiry, phenomenological method, play, games, and cultural process, theories of art and creation, culture and morality, psychological anthropology, paradigm clashes in myth and science. And not least, phenomenology of time consciousness, a 2-semester course, historicity, history and narrative, another 2-semester course, mythical time, and last, the critique of subjectivity. My teachers included people like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Eugene Genlin, the historian of religions, Wendy Doniger, her mentor, Marcia Eliade, and for the last bunch of courses, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, a true luminary in the world of ideas. It was an unbelievable stroke of luck to study and work with all of these people. I was stoked back then, right? And a tad full of myself. I even had the audacity to send Ricoeur 2 papers. One of which was, he spent half the time in Chicago, half the time in Paris. One of which was a developmental account of his own work for the journal Human Development. He sort of like that. And the other, a mammoth tome on psychoanalytic hermeneutics, 69 pages long, in which I questioned some of his own ideas regarding the question of truth in psychoanalysis. He even responded to me in a lovely letter on very delicate paper that arrived from France in a light blue envelope, which I still have. I have to read you just a portion. I want to thank you. It's hard for you. It's so tempting to try to do a French accent. I want to thank you for your 2 articles. You have done a fine job of interpreting my own development. He put it in quotes. Linking together the problematic of the text and that of action is certainly the best perspective on the present phase of my work. I'm like, wow, yeah, that's sweet. But then there was the second piece on the issue of proof in psychoanalysis, in which I essentially asked, are you sure you want to go that route, Paul? Here's what he said. As for your paper on psychoanalytic hermeneutics, I was particularly interested in your discussion of Spence, Schaeffer, Habermas, and myself, and especially in your attempt to rectify the idea of life history by means of that of development in order to find explanatory criteria lacking in the narrative version of psychoanalysis. As for my own use of the word proof, I accept your criticism. I had in mind the notion of vindication rather than the demonstration of truth. It's almost like I was asking the dude to apologize for this horrific death. Good God. It's hard to make sense of that phase. On the one hand, it absolutely reeks of audacity and presumptuousness. Mr. Intellectual, Mr. Big Word Thinker. There had certainly been hints of this, but never in so bold and self-assured a way. It was shocking, really, in retrospect. The more charitable version I might tell is that I was just on fire with ideas. And that something in me had awakened, and through the influence of Ricoeur and others, I had begun to truly think. Both of those versions seem right to me. And I could no doubt offer a few more, and probably the clinicians out there do the same. Whatever it was heady and amazing, and looking backward, pretty ridiculous at times. Now, I don't know if you know Ricoeur. I mean, I know some of you, but, the guy was a real luminary, kind of larger than life. So I got to tell you one other story, equally ridiculous in its way. Okay. Then I'll get to the substance of the talk. One of the seminar courses I took with him met at night. And I stayed a bit later one night to chat with him. And then, generous and obsequious as I was at the time, I asked him whether he'd like a lift home to his apartment a few blocks away. Well, yes, he said, he would appreciate that. So there I was cruising around Hyde Park with one of the preeminent intellectuals of our time, and we arrived at his street, which unfortunately I couldn't go down because it was one way. No worries, he essentially said before the term no worries existed. It's just a little ways up the street, I'll be fine. Well, okay, I didn't want to be pushy, so I let him go. And as I saw him walk away, I saw a car sitting on that street, with a person inside, headlights off. Shade. What do I do? The guy could be a killer. I went home. I mean, what can I do? You know, and of course, I could not help but fantasizing. I just killed. Not a good night of sleep. Fortunately, I knew he was teaching a class in the morning, if he survived, and I raced to campus to see if he was there. He was alive. I don't know that I've ever felt such relief. Mainly, of course, because he'd survived the walk home, but also because there wouldn't be the kind of headlines I'd begun to imagine in my addled, semi-delirious mind. Careless grad student tragically lures 20th century luminary to untimely death. Or couldn't go around the block. Grad students encounter with one-way street leads to horrific death. And how lucky I was to study with Recur and a bunch of other extraordinary people at Chicago, long gone, though just about all of them are. They really are very much with me still. Another stroke of luck brought me to the College of the Holy Cross in 1986 to do what I do and to have amazing students like Jim Dillon, who I know is no longer here, and who I really wish I had the opportunity to see. And students right across the street at Clark, like Neil Karaboff and a bunch of others. I'm not going to burden you with the titles of all the cool courses I got to teach, both within and beyond the psych department, but they included, as you might expect, a big dose of narrative psychology, as well as courses tied to self and identity, art, literature, aesthetic experience, religious experience, the supernatural, and more. I also got to do several team-taught courses, including one called Create Lab, which I taught alongside people from music, visual art, creative writing, and theater. Amazing experience. Not always easy. Another very small story. It was 1998, and it was the day I was to receive my promotional report from my department. Person in my department hands me the cover letter of the report. And it says, dear Mark, as always, we've enjoyed reading the stuff that you write, but we have absolutely no idea how to gauge its significance for the discipline of psychology. Consequently, we're passing it on to the Department of English, which will have a much better chance of being able to determine what it is that you do in my unit. And I look at this thing and I'm like, just kidding. Just kidding. But many a truth is said in jest. So why am I sharing all this background with you? Well, I know that in some people's eyes, the psychological humanities movement, it may seem kind of faddish, the latest new thing. But for me and some others, and Nisha is certainly one. Richard, I'm officially calling you one now. It really is anything but that. As you can see, I've been at it from the get-go, and the fact that there's now something of a home for what some of us have been seeking and what we've been doing is really pretty extraordinary and very gratifying. It feels like we've actually begun to craft the kind of psychology we've imagined it might be. Let me hasten to add a related qualification. For some people, it may seem like old wine in new bottles. There's an element of that, and it stands to reason that some folks in certain quarters of phenomenology, hermeneutics, and the human sciences more generally, might see it this way. I see it this way to some degree. So I wouldn't want to pitch the psychological humanities as some sort of wholesale break from what others have done. For me, at least, it's certainly not that, and there's no need to elevate it above these other worthy and good things. And yet, there are some emphases, you could say, that mark it off as something distinctive and in some ways new. Here, it's fitting that I turn to some of the work that got me here, which I'll discuss in terms of four fairly distinct movements. And I call them movements not because it's, a piece of music, but because they entailed my moving from one phase to another. And I want to be able to capture some of that dynamism. In some ways, my first flirtation with the psychological humanities came in the form of my dissertation titled The Construction and Destruction of Young American Art, a critical inquiry into the conditions of artistic creation. In that work, I explored the life histories of some 50 aspiring artists who had studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago 20 years earlier. My primary aim being to see what they hadn't done during those 20 years and why. And that brought me, to lots of different places all over the country, from Soho to the Hamptons to other places inland, so to speak. In any case, this was really one of my first forays into actually carrying out qualitative inquiry, narrative inquiry. And although the primary focus of the work was on issues tied to art and creativity, I learned a good deal about the challenges of doing qualitative research. But my first real labor of love foray into the psychological humanities was my 1993 book, Rewriting the Self, which comprised close readings of 6 texts, 5 works of nonfiction, autobiographies and memoirs, and 1 work of fiction, all of which were examined in order to establish the philosophical parameters, you might say, for exploring human lives through story. For present purposes, it's the book's epilogue toward a poetics of life history that I most want to address now. And that's because I see it as a kind of pivot upon which much of my future thinking would turn. Poets, I suggested, do not customarily strive for mimetic representation of the world, but nor do they write fictions. What they do instead is rewrite the world, and in such a way that we, readers, may find ourselves in the position of learning or seeing or feeling something about it that might ordinarily have gone unnoticed or unexplicated. Along these same lines, I continue. The narrative imagination engaged in the project of rewriting the self seeks to disclose, articulate, and reveal that very world which literally would not have existed had the act of writing not taken place. In this sense, life histories are indeed artifacts of writing. They are the upsurge of the narrative imagination. And so too, I added, are our own poetic efforts as narrative researchers and scholars. But what, I went on to ask, is the place of such research in the academy? Judging by the history of psychology especially, the answer is, it doesn't have much of one. Among the many reasons for this, I went on to say, there is but a single glaringly obvious one. Inquiries of this sort have not been considered important enough and valid enough by traditional empiricist standards to warrant attention. So how might I respond to that sort of criticism, some of which came from my colleagues in my own department? Well, the first thing I did say in the book, is that the traditional standards, quote, parochial, restrictive, and downright silly, as they often are, need to be challenged and challenged radically. No one has cornered the market on what does and does not constitute valid and important knowledge. I have to wonder whether my colleagues at Holy Cross, where I taught for 38 years, actually read those words. Despite what the authorities might maintain, I continued, there is no reason to assume that psychology is this or is that simply because they say so. I guess that was my first official bit of in-your-face revolutionary rhetoric. It was shortly after that bit of bluster that I quoted a passage from Freud that actually speaks even more directly to the project I seem to be in the middle of launching. In beginning his discussion of the case of Fraulein Elizabeth von R. in Studies on Hysteria, he writes the following. I love this. I have not always been a psychotherapist. Like other neuropathologists, I was trained to employ local diagnoses and electroprognosis, and it still strikes myself as strange that the case histories I write should read like short stories, and that, as one might say, they lack the serious stamp of science. I must console myself with the reflection that the nature of the subject is evidently responsible for this, rather than any preference of my own. The fact is that local diagnosis and electrical reactions lead nowhere in the study of hysteria, whereas a detailed description of mental processes, such as we are accustomed to find in the works of imaginative writers, enables me, with the use of a few psychological formulas, to obtain at least some kind of insight into the course of that affection. It was difficult for Freud to see what he was doing other than as a falling short, right? A lack. This simply wasn't the kind of science that he'd been led to valorize. The problem, though, was not only that sticking with the usual approaches led nowhere, but that their results appeared to be less faithful to the nature of the subject than his own more literary approach. Simply stated, then, I wrote, what Freud realized was that if he wanted to be truly scientific, rather than superficially so, if he wanted to abide by the phenomena themselves, he would have to include a measure of the poetic in his work. The reason was clear. A science shorn of the poetic would be incomplete. It would be rigorous, perhaps, but ultimately empty and false. So it was imperative that there be another form of science, or at least that's how I thought about it at the time, one that embraced the poetic and saw it as integral to the aim of generating valid and significant psychological knowledge. Following Freud's lead, I would come to call this other form poetic science sometime later. I still connect to the idea. Nevertheless, as I would eventually ask, should this work really be considered science? Or is it something else? I struggled with this question for a while, though as I look back, I'm not entirely sure why. At one point, I actually sought to take to task contemporary psychology for not being scientific enough. My argument being that owing to its very scientism, it had violated the demand to be faithful to the object of its inquiry. How then might it become so? I asked. My answer, precisely by becoming more artful in its work. I even came up with a paradoxical slogan of sorts to usher in this putatively new endeavor. The more art, the more science. The more art, the more science. And again, I'm still attracted to this idea, which essentially called for a much more open and capacious conception of what science is and does. Now, for political reasons especially, i.e. the fact that like it or science remains the name of the game for most of academic psychology. But given the situation, it makes sense that some people would continue to play that game, so to speak. Right? And I did, although I really didn't see it as a game. I mean, for me, it was a way of melding ideas that were important to me. But as I confessed about a decade ago, I eventually came to feel that this, science-defining, boundary-expanding project was somewhat disingenuous in a way. This is science too, I had in effect protested for many years. This deserves as much of a place in the hallowed halls of the discipline as what you all do. That's what led to establishing the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, which I support unequivocally. But I eventually found myself asking, and I know this question has been central for Nisha too, do we really need to play the science, the we're doing science game all the time? Why couldn't the discipline, or at least a portion of it, be something truly different? Let me offer an important qualification. I am not in the least interested in science bashing, which I find to be foolish and pointless. And there is ample and justifiable room in psychology for scientific inquiry, both of a natural scientific sort and a social scientific sort. Nor, though, do I feel the need at this point to force all the things that some of us humanistically inclined types do under the umbrella of science. But what else is there? What else I wanted to know might psychology be? I was also concerned with some of what was happening in my home division in the American Psych Association, the Division of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. This led me to another pivotal moment in the form of a brief piece from 2000, which I titled Theory Beyond Theory, in which I somewhat provocatively suggested that, and I quote, despite the desire on the part of many to humanize their inquiries, indeed to bring them closer to the concerns of the humanities, there remains a kind of gravitational pull backward toward the rational, the scientific, the theorizable. What is to be done? More specifically, what would it take for theoretical psychology to move beyond this liminality and to follow through on this humanizing process? And it was at that juncture that I voiced the conviction, quote, that there exists the need for at least a portion of theoretical psychology to move beyond theory as ordinarily conceived altogether, that it simply abandon its commitment to theoretical scientificity and that it become more closely tied to the humanities, end quote. The main reason? Exploring the concrete details of practical experience pointed in the direction of a quite different enterprise, one closer to poetics than theoretics. It was also at that juncture that I had one of my first serious encounters, excuse me, with the idea of the other, especially as addressed by Emmanuel Levinas. One reason for doing so was Levinas's insistence on the particularity and irreducibility of the other person. Concrete reality, he wrote, is man and woman always in relation with the world. These relations cannot be reduced to theoretical representation. The latter would only confirm the autonomy of the thinking subject, the subject closed in on itself. Another reason was Levinas's insistence on the primacy of the ethical dimension. The idea that before there is category, concept, theory, there is the magnetic pull of the other, calling me out of myself, beyond myself, in care and compassion. A third and related reason had to do with Levinas's still broader aim of, quote, thinking otherwise about the human condition, which for me highlighted the importance of psychology moving from its fundamentally egocentric perspective to what I came to call an eccentric perspective, predicated as it is on the magnetic pull of the other. So bringing the idea of poetics and the idea of the other together eventually came to yield a project in the making that I refer to as a poetics of the other. And the idea of the other, I clarified, was not to be restricted to the human other, but to all of those non-human regions of otherness encountered, for instance, in aesthetic and religious experience. And these two constitute a radical challenge to the idea that all psychological life can be understood in purely naturalistic terms, and that science is the go-to mode for containing it. What if that's just not so? What if we are open works that simply don't lend themselves always to the grasp of science as customarily conceived? I'm going to leap ahead a little bit. The culmination of this second movement came in the form of the book Hindsight, which is up there, The Promise and Peril of Looking Backward, which more fully fleshed out the idea of poesis, among other things, and a few others, including one on the idea of poetic science. I'm not just flagging titles here. What I'm really trying to do is capture the trajectory of a burgeoning sensibility, right? And a burgeoning conviction that psychology, or at least a significant portion of it, might really be quite different than what it was and is. Movement 3, thinking and being otherwise. The seeds of this third movement were there in the 2000 piece, not before. But it took me a while to find my way. During the 2000-2001 academic year, I went on sabbatical to Seville in Spain with my family. Unbelievable year. I was on fire, and I got up every morning at the crack of dawn and did my best to begin to craft this very different psychology. Levinas would figure prominently, as would Martin Buber, William James, Charles Taylor, Iris Murdoch, Simone Weil, and others. I'm rocking. Cranked out a draft of a book, sent it off in the hope of getting it published. But it wasn't ready. It was too dominated by my desire to break new ground and my conviction that I was doing it. It was pretty ambitious and self-involved in a way, which really didn't bode well for a book touting the priority of the other. I needed to live with this stuff, and I simply hadn't done that yet. That would be the work of the next dozen or so years. The whole project needed to mature, as did I. What's interesting is that some of the material that found its way into print after these dozen years wasn't all that different in content from the earlier stuff. It was vastly different in spirit and substance. Maybe this is another feature of some of what gets done under the umbrella of the psychological humanities. For some of us, it has to be lived. It has to become part of the very fabric of being, or something like that. Thinking and being otherwise. I did a piece by that title in 2012. And I eventually returned to that aborted book to be in earnest, ready finally to share the words I'd penned, because I felt like I had truly lived them. And so was born the priority of the other. I believed in that book and I still do. And the main reason is that I really tried to clear a space for otherness in its many forms. Levinas continued to play a big role, as you might expect, but the book was about a lot more than that, especially the idea that we humans are inspired and moved in our lives by what exists beyond us. People, of course, but also nature, art, God, and more. Among the many things I suggested toward the end of the book was that it was imperative to fashion a new language for psychology. This language I offered is the language of the other. It is a language I believe that better accommodates the world of meaning, value, and existential nourishment, as well as the world of ethical comportment and commitment, than the one we currently have. Meaning, value, and nourishment do not and cannot come from me, nor do the energies that lead me to be there for other people or the environment or the countless other causes that exist, calling forth our care, our devotion. These energies derive from what is other. By speaking and thinking otherwise, then, we may have in hand both a more truthful account of the human situation and a more adequate foundation for imagining how we might live. There's much more that could be said about that particular project, but I want to leap ahead a few years and make some contact with some work I did for a volume edited by Thomas Teo from York University, who is himself a prominent spokesperson for the psychological humanities, albeit in a quite different key than what we're considering today. The chapter is called Toward a Poetics of the Other, New Directions in Post-Scientific Psychology, and it's basically a piece in which I tried to follow through on what I proposed back in 2000 in the Theory Beyond Theory piece. But the question here is, what might a poetics of the other look? And here, I want to turn briefly to Stephen Toulmin's penultimate chapter in his book, Return to Reason. The chapter is titled The World of Where and When. For Toulmin, this world could be found in full bloom in the work of Virginia Woolf, who, and I'm quoting Toulmin, did her best to pin down on paper the experiences of a person, a place, or a moment exactly as pen and ink could afford. She did this with an eye to colors, to the produce on fruit and vegetable salt, to the scent and dust of the seasons, as well as to the expressions on the faces of people she passed in the streets, the irritations evinced in these encounters, and the anxieties they aroused. These anxieties were aroused in the form of her, Mrs. Toulmin again, perfectly rounded character, Clarissa Dalloway, from her novel, Mrs. Dalloway. Toulmin acknowledges that the experiences she is documenting bear significantly on the psychology of perception. But, he says, unlike the theoretical analysis of perception by academics, which lacks all emotional overtones, Woolf's writing is always tinged with feelings of joy and anger. This mode of writing can also be found, certainly, in the middle section of To the Lighthouse, section titled Time Passes, when Woolf describes a vacant seaside house. It's a beautiful section of the book. As Toulmin notes, only one thing happens in the house during this period of emptiness to mark the passage of time. At one point, a scarf falls. In this very moment, the temporal character of our daily experience leaps out from the page. Indeed, it does. I can remember the first time I read this section of the book, how moving it was in its spaciousness and how real. Here was a world made present, an actual world of where and when, a world filled with exactly those emotional overtones Toulmin is referring to. How much more adequate it was to experience than most academic psychology, and how much more valuable, I think, for our understanding and our feeling. Toulmin also makes brief mention of the poet Wallace Stevens, who also was concerned with these minutiae of feeling and who addresses what separates an academic obsession with formal rationality from everyday life, charged with all of its passions. Of course, lots of other artists and writers might have been mentioned in this context as well. So as I asked at the very end of the chapter I've been discussing, can there be a psychology as attuned to the texture of experience as Woolf's fiction or Stevens' poetry? I believe there can. Movement 4, reimagining psychology. I might have to cut some stuff. I'm going to discuss some of the work on my mother and the dementia. But my mother died at age 93 after a dozen or so years of being afflicted with dementia. Now, one of the things that I had suggested, drawing on the whole idea of poetics and so on, I came to find that it was imperative that this work, which eventually assumed the form of a book, imperative that it be literary in nature, at least in part. And that's because, as I put it, there is no detaching the findings from the story I seek to tell. There is no detaching the content of what I say from the sensuous and sonorous materiality of the words I use to say it. The medium in question, language, is not merely a vehicle for transmitting information in this sort of work. It matters in a way that standard scientific writing generally does not. What's more, it seeks to carry not only the cognitive dimension of what's being said, but feeling. It seeks to express, evoke, and may at times even move. I don't seek to move people, certainly not in any calculated way. Rather, I need to find words that can somehow carry the emotional weight of the phenomena and bring it forth so that readers can feel it too. At the same time, and here I'm speaking about stuff that is directly pertinent, I'm not merely interested in telling her story in the manner of a memoirist or a biographer. As a longtime student of memory and identity and related issues, I want to do more. I want to speak to these issues in a way that will contribute to knowledge in some modest way. I need to proceed very cautiously as I go about this work. I'm only considering a single case. The case happens to be my mother, and I'm hardly in a position of being able to universalize the findings at hand. They are not findings, not in the customary sense of the word. They're not a function of discrete methodological procedures. They do not and cannot stand apart from the story I seek to tell. And it's patently clear that what I had seen transpire through the course of my mother's and my life over those dozen years is unique to us. This doesn't mean, though, that there are no bridges to be built between our situation and those of others. There can be, and there are. My hope, therefore, is that others facing similar circumstances will read and benefit from the work, seeing in this particular case dimensions of experience and meaning that they can relate to their own situations. I also hope that some researchers and scholars in psychology and beyond, gerontology, dementia studies, narrative psychology, whatever, will read and benefit from the work, seeing it not only as an interesting story, I hope, but a piece of psychological scholarship able to make some modest contribution to knowledge. Let me try to simplify some of this. Following Heidegger and others, it's important for certain modes of psychological expression to be an event, by which I mean an occasion for calling forth something existentially significant in the reader or viewer. Something that doesn't merely inform them, but transforms them, in the sense of disclosing dimensions of being and feeling that were lying dormant. This is the poetic moment of the event. It serves to disrupt, disclose, and awaken. But we're also talking about an event, as I just said, that entails some measure of conceptual knowing, of revealing something about the phenomenon of interest that can be brought into relation with existing knowledge, even if only to question or challenge. Let me return to my mother's story to give you a sense of what I mean as I work towards concluding. In the beginning phase of her dementia, my mother vehemently protested what was happening to her and in her. As I would eventually write of this phase, there was a severe distinction between what my mother was and what she was in the process of becoming. A once able but no longer person. And she knew it. It was as if everything was crashing down. All the things that defined her were coming undone. She was coming undone. And she so felt it acutely. And I remember wishing that she could just let it go, give herself over to her situation and live her life as best she could, unhampered by all the images and scripts about autonomy, competence, self-sufficiency, and so on that had come to permeate her existence. She couldn't do it early on. She was in too deep. Given her situation, in fact, there was really only one thing that could make that wish come true. Namely, the very dissolution of her autobiographical self. And this could only occur, of course, when her dementia intensified. And sure enough, I began to see something interesting happening. It took the form of a correlation. The more her autobiographical self was on the line, calling into question her competency and so on, the more painful things would be. And the more it was quieted, listening to music, going out for a nice drive, going for an afternoon cocktail or a good meal, the more at ease she would be. This is when I realized that as her dementia, quote, got worse, she herself would probably be less tortured by her life. And maybe with the continued loss of her autobiographical self, I wondered, she would even be able to experience a kind of carefree selflessness, an unself-conscious immersion into the world. That's what I call dementia's tragic promise. Here's a passage from the book I eventually did that speaks to this transformation. It was one of those fall days in New England that demanded your attention. Mom and I decided to take a drive up a country road toward Mount Wachusett, which offers vistas of the lush valley below. the mountains of New Hampshire to the north, and on a crystal clear day like that one, the Boston skyline. I turned the car stereo to a local classical station. Up we went, climbing the road to the mountain, music playing, sky blue, the leaves beginning to turn, shaking loose, skittering across the road. She was transfixed. These are all her work. Beautiful. It must be peak now. Such a pretty moon. Beautiful, beautiful day. What a day. Spectacular day for a ride like this. What a spectacular, beautiful day. Every moment was new and brought new delights. As a quick aside, I might note much the same thing happened later on when I brought her a gooey piece of chocolate cake. This almost sounds perverse, but I'd give her a bite of the cake. Oh. 30 seconds later. You want to go? Oh, that is good. I mean, it's awful in a way, but to be that turned on for every bite. But back to the mountain, although she certainly hadn't done so by choice, my mother had in fact given herself over to the world or been taken over by the world at moments like these, such that it could appear and reappear again and again in all of its bounty and beauty. She was awestruck, taken back by what the world could be, what the world is, uncluttered by all the noise and busyness we tend to bring to her. I referred to her as the Buddha at one point. So I learned something about that. Among other things, I learned that dimensions of reality can be revealed even in a dreaded and dreadful malady such as dementia, that are real and vitally significant for our understanding of the human condition. A little bit more. She said I could have an hour. So I've spoken so far about the poetic and intellectual moment of what I call the event. As I move toward closing, let me add one more defining moment. In telling my mother's story, I tried to find words to speak her world, and in doing so, open up an uncharted region of questioning and knowing. Throughout all of this, I sought to see her and engage with her in her otherness, her distinct mode of being. I did not always succeed, especially in the early years when I could be frustrated and annoyed. But Lord knows I tried. Seeing others in this way, uncontainable as they are, is nothing less than a moral imperative, even a kind of command. I'm thinking again of some of Levinas's work here. There's a moral consequence to such seeing as well, attentive seeing. For if the philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch is right, and I quote, the more the separateness and differentness of other people is realized, and the fact seen that another person has needs and wishes as demanding as one's own, the harder it becomes to treat a person as a thing. For Murdoch, there is thus a connection between beholding the reality of the other person and treating them with care. If, moreover, she continues, we ask further questions about the faculty which is supposed to relate us to what is real and thus bring us to what is good, the idea of compassion or love will be naturally suggested. She thus speaks of the realism of compassion, the realism of compassion, and seeks to underscore the profound importance, indeed urgency, of adopting ways of seeing that are truly attentive to the other. Because it's through such attention, undivided attention, that care and compassion are born. This is the ethical moment of the event. Yes, I wanted the book I eventually did to be a good evocative read, one that brought people nearer to teeming life, as I call it, in its brutality and its beauty. As a work of psychology, I also wanted it to speak in some modest way to dementia, as well as to memory, identity, selfhood, relationality, and so on. Through it all, I tried to tell a story and in a way paint a picture that might move people to think, feel, and maybe even act differently in the face of what is so often seen as an utterly and unspeakably tragic loss. It is loss, but at least in some instances, it can also be more. Some people were horrified at what my mother had become. Slumped in a wheelchair, virtually blind, mottled skin, and missing teeth. They would sometimes come to see her after not having seen her for a year or two and walk out sobbing. My family and I came to see things differently. Here's how I put it in the book. What was for them a palpable ugliness was for some of us a kind of beauty, the beauty of nature, stark and real. What a gift it was to be present literally and figuratively to my mother's changing face, with its creases and folds, its caverns and abysses, its profound there-ness, not to be sidestepped or elided, but to be seen. Maybe some of those reading the book could come there with me and see different, see more, see better. And maybe through this seeing, love better. I ask again, I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time. One more paragraph. I ask again, can works of psychology generate the kind of, I'll call it incarnational resonance that a great work of literature or work of art has, and thereby bring us closer to reality? As I said before, I believe they can. And I think they will be works of a unique sort, hybrid forms that hover in the space between science and art, may be serving to diminish the distance between the two. They will not be bound by parochial methodological requirements or by firm borders ordaining what is and isn't real psychology. And this is important, and they will be carried out not only by those who call themselves psychologists, but also by artists, historians, literary scholars, philosophers, and more, which is to say by any and all who seek to explore and speak to the vast, uncontainable territory of human experience in ways that bear upon psychological life. Let me hasten to add that this includes not only those wishing to speak to the loftier side of the human experience, but also the awful, depraved side, especially as manifested among other places in the political arena. And that's because it may only be through works characterized by what might be called ethically saturated feeling that we might break through the crust of numbness, indifference, and the kind of coercive designs of attention. By clearing inadequate space for such works through the psychological humanities, my hope is that psychology may finally succeed in being anxious in the right way and thereby becoming more adequate to the human condition. Thank you. Happy to take some questions, but I need to wet my whistle, as they say. Sorry for going on a bit long.
And Mark, if you don't mind just repeating back like a sentence for what the question was before
Oh,
responding,
yeah, sure.
that could help our virtual.
Sure. That means something else. Yeah.
I wanted to see if someone else had something first, but I automatically, like, right off the bat, I was inspired by a lot of the things that you said in this speech. You know, there were a lot of things that resonated with myself and with a lot of the experiences that I, in some way share with you in some of my own journeys through psychology. And one thing that especially stuck out to me was when you, at the very beginning of the speech even, when you started off on this note of psychology being inherently an anxious discipline,
Yeah.
but in a lot of ways being anxious in the wrong way. This immediately made me kind of go back to a lot of the discussions I've had with various people, especially in this program,
Yeah.
about the problem of physics envy, right? This sort of an idea that psychology has physics envy, which I see as almost inherently being an anxious experience on the part of psychologists themselves. Envy itself is an anxiety over feeling deprived of something, over
Right.
not having something that we see someone else having.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I was
Yeah.
sitting with that. I was just wondering how you kind of saw this, right? How that resonates with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, psychology was also struggling for legitimacy. And it's interesting to note that there really were multiple pathways that psychology might have taken. I mentioned the philosopher Stephen Toulmin. He has a wonderful book called Cosmopolis, when he talks about two of those pathways, and one would have moved much more directly. He cites Montaigne and a bunch of others. It would have moved much more directly into the particular, into the fabric of experience and so forth. And then, there's a path that basically gets carved out by Descartes, among others. Yeah, the bad boy, so to speak. So, look, I would never want to diminish the kind of excitement that happened in the late 1800s when people like Wilhelm Wundt and others were basically saying, it might be possible to really crack some of the mysteries of the human experience to the extent that we can bring experimentation to it. And that immediately set up a tension that existed right away between him and people like William James, who said, well, this is great. You've adhered in a rigorous way to a scientific methodology and scientific aims and so forth. But for James, it was sapped of the kind of human stuff that he wanted. But yeah, I mean, maybe there's an element of envy, but these things also carry their own momentum. And some of it also had to do with, what was happening in terms of logical positivism and empiricism and so on. I mean, it's striking that, when I was an undergrad, probably the reigning psychology was behaviorism. And behaviorism essentially said, as many of you know, we cannot possibly study inner experience. Nobody's ever seen it. It can't be measured. There's always a gap between experience and language. Consequently, we need to send that stuff off to other people who are willing to do that deep dive. For us, we're going to stick with behavior, right? That lasted a long time. A similar move has happened in certain quarters of neuroscience, because we can see to some extent what's happening in the brain, and it is important. But the problem is, so many of those approaches sort of colonize psychology, and to insist, as I put it, maybe hyperbolically, that it be this and emphatically not. You know, if you look at the first page, for instance, of Watson's book Behaviors, which he wrote in, I think, 1925, maybe. I mean, he lays into consciousness like it's, you know, the return of animistic thinking from, you know, primitive times. Those are his words. So, yeah, there's a lot of that. And just to be clear, as I said at one point, and I really do believe this, I forgot to repeat the question, but I hope it's not. I really do believe that there are aspects of human psychological functioning that lend themselves perfectly well to a range of forms of scientific inquiry. It'd be sheer folly to suggest otherwise. But I would hardly want to exclude that which cannot be fitted in that way. And so, you know, I titled the subtitle of one of those talks, the papers that I gave, was called Toward a Post-Scientific Psychology. And in that paper, the way I formulated it is, you know, what's left after science has properly had its say? And my answer was, like, a lot. Like a really.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm tired too. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned others, identities, devotion to the other. You also mentioned you having to sit with your work within yourself when you're ready to get it out. So how do you balance this focus and attention between them?
Well, I mean, how do we balance the tension in a sense between other and self? How does one find one's way internally, and yet continue to, you know, maintain a relationship, so to speak, with thinkers like Levinas, for whom the primary category is the other. I don't think that they're at odds. Let me just say that on a personal level, you know, my own life is a perpetual oscillation between tending to aspects of my own self and being there for the other. The last thing I wanted to do in telling my mother's story was come off as some sort of caregiver here, right? Gosh, she's always there with mom. You know, I wrote in the book, sometimes I think about going and spending some time with her and it's a nice day and instead I'll have a margarita. Right? So, you know, there's the issue of kind of arbitrating in a sense between different claims. But, you know, I also had to be authentically inspired by what I was encountering in the world during those 12 years that the book had to settle and mature. And that meant not only reading carefully and caringly, it also meant being more attentive to the world and trying to understand in an embodied way what I was talking about. And the way to do that was to see and feel what I could of the world. And upon doing that, it really did become radiantly clear to me that although the self remains a significant and important category, we needn't bash it. We needn't consider it, you know, erased in the sand like Foucault proclaimed at the end of one of his books. But I wanted to turn my attention otherwise because I became convinced that the language that we have for thinking about psychology is actually belied by much of what a human experience reveals. And so I really came to think that we were using like a false language. I mean, if you think about something like psychotherapy, yeah, we could talk about it as the restoration of the self or self-realization and so on. Oftentimes what really needs to happen is the restoration of the world, right? A world that can enliven and inspire and engage and renew. And that's not always something that comes from within. So there's no simple way to answer your question. I think it's a really good one. And sometimes it's a juggling act. Sometimes it's a juggling. I will say though, that even back in 1993, when I wrote Rewriting the Self, the first chapter of that book dealt with St. Augustine's Confession. And, you know, it's often considered like the first autobiography, a penetrating inquiry into the recesses of his troubled psyche and all the rest. It's also about God and about what is it that led him beyond his own egocentric preoccupations, his desire for recognition, and all the rest. And so even at that early stage, although I didn't know beans about Levinas, the idea of the other and what exists beyond us, what draws us out of ourselves, was already there, looming large. Thank you. Yeah.
Moving forward with a egocentric idea of psychology. One of my biggest fears about any art psychology programs is that it may turn out into some solipsistic piece of knowledge that is useful only for the researcher who carries the program. So I'm wondering about this aspect in your work. What aspects make the research significant for others who read it, and how to make a good quality psychology in your opinion?
Yeah. I think that's another great question. I mean, I can tell you that, you know, I love doing theoretical and philosophical work, and I always will. But so much of that work was for other people doing that kind of work. Rarely did any of us in the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical, rarely could we break beyond our own enclave and speak more cogently to a wider audience. Some of it has to do with how you write. For instance, the book Hindsight, it's not for everybody, but I wanted it to be able to be read by, for instance, people in my family. And if they opened the pages and just couldn't make heads or tails of it because it was so abstruse and specialized, I will have failed. Now, they still tease me about it because they still don't understand it. But so it goes, you know? But I really have come to feel over the years that it becomes more and more important to speak to a wider audience. That's not true for everybody. There are some people who really love the specialized stuff and speaking to their peers and developing this nugget of knowledge and so on. Have at it, right? When it came to the book on my mother, especially, which was sort of my put up or shut up thing, like, are you gonna do this or are you gonna just talk about it? I didn't want to write a pop. Why? Because when I was sitting by my mother's bedside, Levinas was with me. It's not like I went home and I said, how can I bring those philosophical ideas to bear? It's like, oh, this is what he was talking about. So I had to walk that tightrope. And one of the things that I did is I wrote a pretty dense theoretical chapter on relational ethics and research and so on. And I said to the reader, you can skip this if you're not interested in this stuff and cut to the chase. Go to the story. I want the reader not just to read another interesting biography about somebody with dementia. There are loads of them. Because there are ideas to draw out that I could tap into by virtue of my own history, my own, all that sort of stuff. And it's a book, it ain't a bestseller. But to give you a sense of reaching an audience, I got contacted by somebody who's a professor of neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Massachusetts, in Boston, who said, you know, I deal with these people all the time. And your account really spoke to me because it allowed me to see the kind of living story dementia that most of the people in his walk of life don't see or don't emphasize. And he even invited me to do a chapter. Get this, this is free. Would you consider doing a chapter for the Handbook of Clinical Neurology? I'm like, you sure? He said, yeah, I want you to do what you do so that people can see it. So there's luck involved in all this too. But if you're somebody who doesn't want to remain in a hermetically sealed academic, you know, cocoon, do what you can to break out and make sure you speak the common tongue as best you can. Yeah. Nisha.
I just wanted to ask a question. I wanted to ask your advice for us because it's like your vision is interdisciplinary. Your work at the College of the Holy Cross has been interdisciplinary. You basically implied at the end of your talk that artists can be psychologists in their own right if they're creating works about psychological life and the human condition. And
Yeah.
what could you see as the vision for, you know, a school that would center around the psychological humanities, or what could that look like pragmatically?
Yeah. Well, I mean, among other things, it means breaking away from your departmental enclaves. But that's easier said than done. I mentioned this course, Create Lab, that we did at Holy Cross. You know, we got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and the grant was basically to, you know, infuse the arts in a more visible way at Holy Cross. But we also wanted it to be of intellectual substance, and students got course credit and all the rest. It was simply one of the best experiences for all involved. Like, I taught a class on the work of Simone Weil with an incredible composer. We talked about the idea of gravity and the idea of grace. I gave a talk about my mother in that class also. So we had a theme. The theme for the class was time, memory, and identity. We had some core readings. We had amazing visiting artists who would hold workshops that all of us would attend. And I'll tell you, it's through it all, it was a roller coaster. Some students were nauseated. It's my grade. I'm not an artist. I can't, how are you going to evaluate me on this? It's not going to be arbitrary. For others, it was the peak of their academic experience because it allowed not only for bridges to be built, but for bridges to be dissolved. You know, to be in a classroom, we met in a theater space, in a classroom, next to somebody who is a theater professor saying, when you get up, this is how you need to speak in order to make your points. And she would have students move, and we did exercise with students that you probably couldn't do that. Right? Like in one exercise, just to get us, we were able to move to somebody else and manipulate their arms and say in a gentle, non-sexualized way. So student on student, student on professor, right? Tough territory. And as I say, for some, it's like, whoa, this ain't what I signed up for, man. Get me back into, there was a lot, I was gonna say econ, I don't wanna make fun of econ. But there was an econ professor in the class and he rounded up so many of his Echo Act students to take the class. They wanted to head for the hills, but some of them caught the wave. And it was wonderful. So I think oftentimes there needs to be concrete initiatives. People don't get together just voluntarily out of nowhere. I mean, you mentioned to, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, the philosophy pro, who's doing the interesting stuff on imagination. Why don't we get together? And you mean it, and he means it, but how are you gonna do that? So unless you get together and have lunch and say, what might we concretely do to build some kind of serviceable bridge between what you do and what I do, it's not gonna happen. But there, there's not, I don't know, there's not a simple answer to the question. I wish there was.
Torn between the first person, just because they were first, or Lisa Osbeck, because.
Oh, just do both.
Okay, all right. In that case.
We'll have breakfast.
Okay, the first person who posted the question writes, going back to Descartes and the Cartesian split that feels so foundational to scientific psychology, what's the collective trauma that was operating then, and what's operating now to maintain this split that contributes to this resistance to psychological humanities? Related to that, who do you think is most resistant to this poetic approach? How might they be persuaded to let the humanities into psychology?
All right, let's go to Lisa. No, I'm not. I mean, there's a lot to that question. I don't know how much resistance there is, but it can come off like a kind of brand, right? What is this? Well, and does it include the human sciences? Does it not? I think the whole thing needs to be formulated as inclusive a way as possible. I spoke to somebody recently, she'll remain unnamed, she's a friend, and she said, I think it actually diminishes some of the other stuff that's happening because now it becomes the thing and the other things become sort of, absolutely no reason for why that would be. So I certainly don't want to think of it as a branding. I think of it as a visible tag that allows for a certain energy and a certain momentum that I think might be useful for the many people in very different quarters who on some level have been fighting the same fight for years on it. Okay? The other thing I would say is that I think it might be extra important at this particular moment to fight for the humanities. I mean, money's being taken away from the arts and humanities for obvious reasons, or they're being corrupted. I think we're seeing what might be called, and I don't want this to sound too hyper, a kind of depletion of our cultural resources. And the humanities have rich resources, and psychology has rich resources to be able to speak to things that are going on in the world in ways that also doesn't happen very often. So that's a kind of long-winded answer. I don't know. The trauma stuff, I'm not sure how to respond. What is the trauma that?
So Lisa's commenting question. She says, thank you, Mark. Really enjoyed your talk for many reasons. Question, in addition to wrestling with its status as a science, the question of the extent to which it is a basic or applied science has also been central to psychology's history. I really appreciated that you clarified ways psychological humanities can contribute to knowledge, and in the example of your relationship with your mother, suggested a way of framing it almost as a kind of intervention. Beyond the level of the individual other, the individual case, how might you envision psychological humanities being an intervention of sorts in a troubled world with its problems of immense complexity?
Yeah. I mean, I will give you some examples, and I don't actually know whether to call it psychological humanities, but because some of the writing I've done in relationship to the political has been a bit different. But I'm a student of narrative, and I began to see the way in which narrative was being used and abused in the political sphere. And I even co-edited a book a few years back called The Use and Abuse of Stories. And one of the things I became particularly interested in, and I think no matter what your political persuasion is in this country, is how is it possible to break through, as I put it in the paper at one point, the hardened crust of numbness and indifference and massive amounts of noise coming through information, misinformation, disinformation, and so on. And I remember at one point when this was years ago, when there was stuff happening at the border in a big way. And you know, it's easy enough on in some weird level to be able to say, okay, there's a bunch of kids being held in cages. Oh, that sucks. That's inhumane. Turn the page. If you saw them, or if you read a piece that talked about their experience, you might think different. But there's one image in particular that called out to me a kind of responsibility that I began to think I had as a writer. It was an image of a little boy dead in the river, trying to cross the border. It was a widely circulated. An image like that can generate, I mean, it can still generate indifference, right? And if you see a barrage of those images all the time, it's not going to take. But then I did begin to ask, how can I begin to do work that might speak to some of the larger issues that are troubling the world? And I will confess to you right now, and I've said this to David Goodman and other people associated with psych humanities, I said, I'm all into the project, but I'm finding it hard to get the juice up for some of it, given the state of the world and its needs. I said, so whatever I'm going to be doing going forward, it's got to be able to do something that speaks to it. But I'd be lying if I told you I had an easy path forward or really knew what it was that I or others ought to do to speak to it. You know, it's big. It's big.
Over, have dinner reservation. But I'm gonna maybe end, I think that's an important note to end on, because as I'm, you know, Mark is such a mentor to me, and the more I've been learning about your work, the more it's just so clear how an ethical compass has been driving you for decades, and like you are driven by compassion. Like that is what your entire project is about. And does that resonate?
As long as you don't exclude things like rage and, you know.
Yeah, well, there's agape anger as agape love, yeah, and art as the language for compassion and rage and love. So thank you. Can we give a round of applause? I do want to say this conversation can continue tomorrow morning for students in the class right now in the room that want to ask more questions for Mark or share your own projects. We are meeting in Melson 207 at 10:30, from 10:30 to 12. And he'll be around. And so please come if you are free and we can continue the conversation. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to.
That was so easy.
Okay.
Yes, it was
Yeah.
fun. I learned so much.
Yeah, and there's sections there's sections that really are directed toward you that I just.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I cut
yeah.
some of that. I can tell. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was learning as your students. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw you out there and I said, I know that.
I wanted me to give you this message. I enjoyed helping you. That's the main reason why I'm in Philly. He's giving my life. That's nice.
I'm gonna take this like my.
Yeah.